Welcome back to Sleep Well Horrors. It's the end of the week, and we got a story for you, alright? New story, nice and long one, just for you. I made it extra long. Just joking, it's not that long. The story today is called, I visited my grandparents' secluded farmhouse. They were hiding something terrifying. And the author is CreepyStoriesJR on Reddit. He'll be linked, his YouTube will be linked, and his story will be linked. So go ahead and check that out. Go ahead and give the story a like. But as well, don't forget to drop a quick comment at the end. In the middle, at the beginning, doesn't matter. We're gonna keep talking about it. And then if you like the video, go ahead and subscribe and like. If you like us, we'll be here every week, twice a week. Other than that, we have a subreddit now that is also linked, and a Discord where you can join the community and interact with us and other people who enjoy the show. I think that covers all the bases there, and I think we're ready. I think we're ready to give a good read here. As always, Andrea's gonna read first. Set us off.
I hadn't seen my grandparents in years, not since I was a kid. When the long summers at the remote farmhouse felt like a welcome escape from the noise of the city. Now, standing on the gravel driveway with my car engine cooling behind me, the place looked smaller somehow, worn down by time. The house was exactly as I remembered it, tall and slightly sagging, with weathered white paint peeling from the sides. It sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fields and thick woods that seemed to go on forever. I had taken them up on their offer to visit for a few days. A break was what I needed, I told myself. Things in the city had become overwhelming. Work, life, everything. I needed to clear my head, and when Grandma mentioned in one of her letters that they missed having me around, I thought, why not? It wasn't like I had anywhere else to be. As I climbed the porch steps, they were already waiting for me, their familiar faces smiling warmly. Grandma was just as I remembered, her soft gray hair pinned neatly back and her small frame draped in one of her floor aprons. She waved, her eyes crinkling at the corners.
Well, look at ya,
she said, pulling me into a hug as soon as I reached the top step.
all grown up. It's so good to have you back, dear.
I hugged her back, the smell of lavender and freshly baked bread filling the air.
It's good to be back,
I said, trying to mask the awkwardness. It had been so long and everything felt distant. Grandpa stood behind her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his old work trousers. He nodded in my direction, his smile more reserved.
About time you visited.
He said in a low, gravelly voice.
Your grandmother's been going on about it for weeks. I know.
I replied, chuckling softly.
Sorry it took so long. Well, you're here now,
Grandma said, stepping back and looking me over with a proud smile.
That's all that matters. Come inside. We've got dinner ready.
I followed them into the house, the door creaking shut behind me. Inside, everything looked almost exactly as I remembered it. The dark wooden floors, the old photographs lining the walls, and the heavy furniture that seemed like it hadn't moved in decades. It was like stepping into a time capsule, a place untouched by the outside world.
As we moved through the narrow hallway toward the kitchen, something caught my eye in the living room. I slowed my pace, glancing over my shoulder. There, hanging above the fireplace, was the oversized family portrait. It was a painting I vaguely remembered from my childhood. Though I hadn't thought about it in years, I depicted my grandparents, younger and more vibrant, standing in the center, surrounded by other family members. Most of them had passed, the colors were faded, and the faces had that old World Series look to them, like they were posing for something much more formal than a family portrait.
But one person stood out to me now, someone I didn't remember seeing before. Toward the back of the group, half obscured by shadow, was a man I couldn't place. He wasn't standing like the others, though. He seemed slightly turned away, as if he were on the edge of the scene, almost like an afterthought.
Come on, honey,
Grandma called from the kitchen, pulling me from my thought.
Dinner's getting cold.
I blinked and tore my eyes away from the painting, making my way into the kitchen where the warm glow of the overhead light and the smell of stew greeted me. We sat around the worn wooden table and Grandma ladled steaming bowls of her homemade stew in front of us.
That sounds really good right now.
Stew? Yeah.
This homemade dinner is making me hungry. It's been so long since we've had you here,
she said, smiling as she set a plate of bread on the table.
I hope you're hungry.
I nodded through the strange feeling of the painting still clung to me.
Yeah, I am. Thanks, Grandma. This smells great.
We ate in relative silence, the familiar sounds of clinking spoons and soft conversation filling the room. They asked me how life had been in the city, how work was going, and I gave them the usual vague answers. I didn't want to get into the details of why I really needed a break, how the stress had gone to me, how everything had started feeling overwhelming. It wasn't something I was ready to talk about. After dinner, I found myself wandering back into the living room. I didn't know why, but I felt drawn to the painting again, like I needed to look at it more closely. There was something unsettling about the way that man in the background was positioned, half hidden, his face barely visible in the dim light of the room. I stood there staring at the portrait for longer than I meant to, trying to figure out if I had forgotten him or if something was different. His expression seemed almost blank like the others, but there was something in his eyes that unnerved me.
Everything okay, dear?
I jumped slightly, turning to see Grandma standing in the doorway with the soft smile on her face. I hadn't heard her come up behind me.
Yeah.
I said quickly, forcing a smile.
Just looking at the portrait, I don't remember it that well from when I was a kid.
She stepped into the room, her eyes flickering to the painting.
Oh, that old thing?
She said with a soft chuckle.
Who's that man in the back?
I asked, pointing at the man.
I don't think I recognize him.
Grandma's smile faltered for the briefest of moments, and then she recovered, shaking her head slightly.
Oh, that's just another relative. He's always been there.
She looked at me again, her smile a little more forced.
You probably just don't remember.
I nodded, though something about her response didn't sit right with me.
Yeah, maybe. Anyway, it's getting late. You should get some rest,
she said, her voice gentle but firm.
Good to have you here again. I hesitated for a moment, glancing at the painting one last time before turning to follow her. As I made my way down the hall to the guest room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the portrait. The guest room was small, with an old wooden bed and a heavy quilt draped over it. The room was pristine, almost unnervingly so, as if no one had set foot in it for years. I felt like an intruder, like I didn't belong there. Still, exhaustion from the long drive took over, and I collapsed to bed, pulling the quilt all around me. The silence of the house was unsettling. I had forgotten how quiet it could be out here, so far from the city. No traffic, no sirens, no hum of the life beyond the walls. Just the soft creaking of the house and the distant rustle of the wind through the trees. Why are you shaking your head?
Because that's just a scary, not hearing anything, but I don't know, it's like a scary thought.
That's how I grew up.
That's scary.
When I moved to the city, I was like, God damn, it's loud here. Shit.
But at least you know what the sounds are, you know? Like, if you're out in the middle of nowhere, just your house, and you hear something, it's like, what could it be?
That's
an
true,
intruder? Yeah. A serial killer?
I'm sure.
Ghost?
Intruders aren't very common out there, but yeah, I get what you're saying.
Eventually, sleep pulled me under. The next morning, I awoke to the soft light filtering through the thin curtains of the guest room. The house was quiet, as it always was. I stretched and got out of bed, the old wooden floorboards creaking under my weight. The room was still pristine as ever, the air slightly stale as if it hadn't been opened in years. I glanced around, my eyes lingering on the closed closet door. A small shiver crawled up my spine, but I shook it off. Breakfast was simple: toast, eggs, and coffee. Grandma was already up, bustling around the kitchen with her usual energy. while Grandpa sat quietly at the table flipping through the old newspaper. They seemed as peaceful as ever. I joined them.
How'd you sleep, dear?
Grandma asked, setting a plate in front of me.
Fine, thanks. The house is quiet.
Grandma smiled.
That's the charm of the country. You get used to it.
We ate in relative silence. Grandpa glanced at me over the rim of his coffee mug, his expression unreadable. After breakfast, I wandered through the house, reacquainting myself with its layout, its old furniture, and the relics of a simpler time. I walked through the narrow hallway that led back into the living room, my steps slowing as I approached the large family portrait above the fireplace.
The man in the back, he'd moved. I froze in place, my heart skipping a beat as I stared at the painting. I was sure of it. The unknown figure, the man I didn't recognize, had definitely shifted. He was no longer half obscured in the background. He had moved closer to the foreground. His shadowy face, now clearer, his eyes dark, almost black, seemed to stare directly at me. For a long moment, I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring back at him, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Had I imagined it? I took a step closer and squinted at the portrait. The rest of the people, the ones I recognized as my grandparents and long-dead relatives, hadn't changed. Their solemn expressions were just as I remembered. But this man, this stranger, was different. His presence in the painting was more pronounced, his face more defined, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me.
See, that's scary. I backed away. I turned to leave the room, but my gaze kept flickering back to the portrait. Something about it was wrong, and the longer I looked, the more I felt the weight of the man's eyes following me. I found Grandma in the kitchen, humming softly as she wiped down the counter.
Why don't you go help your grandfather outside? He could use an extra pair of hands,
Grandma said. I hesitated, glancing back toward the living room.
Yeah, sure.
I stepped outside, the fresh air a welcome relief from the oppressive stillness of the house. Grandpa was already in the yard, mending an old fence. He worked quietly, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he were trying to keep himself busy. I joined him, picking up a hammer and some nails, though my mind was still on the portrait. The man in the painting, his face wouldn't leave my thoughts. For the rest of the day, I helped Grandpa with odd chores around the property, but the feeling of being watched never left me.
That night, I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling once again. The silence of the farmhouse had taken on a different tone, one that felt less peaceful and more expectant. I rolled over, my eyes drawn to the closet door at the far end of the room. It was closed, as it had been the night before, but now it seemed different, ominous. Somehow, I tried to ignore it, but a small part of me kept waiting for it to crack open on its own. Bro is hallucinating now. He's just so scared.
Is he hallucinating, or are things really moving around?
The minutes dragged by, and as I started to drift off to sleep, I heard footsteps. Soft at first, but unmistakable, just outside my bedroom door.
I don't think he's hallucinating. The footsteps continued, moving back and forth, as if someone was walking up and down the hall. I held my breath, straining my ears to listen. The sound was so faint, but it was there. I thought maybe it's just one of my grandparents checking in on me. They continued, soft but persistent, the sound growing louder the more I focused on it. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. With shaky hands, I threw back the blankets and got out of bed. My feet cold against the wooden floor. I walked toward the door. The footsteps stopped.
And I would just go to sleep.
Why would he even get up? I would not get up. You know what I would do? I would put the blanket over my head and just
nothing.
Nope.
I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, listening to the silence that had suddenly filled the house. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling slightly. I turned the knob and yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. No one, just a dim light from the window at the end of the hall. Everything was still. Nothing moved. The air was thick with an unnatural quiet. I back into the room, my pulse racing, and I closed the door quickly behind me. My hands were shaking as I leaned against the door. The footsteps didn't return, but the unease stayed with me.
The following morning, I woke up with the heaviness in my chest. The previous night's event clung to me like a fog I couldn't shake. And as much as I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, deep down I knew better. I got dressed and headed into the kitchen, hoping that a simple morning routine might help shake the lingering dread. Grandma was already bustling around the stove, humming softly to herself. The smell of coffee filled the air, and for a brief moment, the farmhouse felt warm and familiar again.
Good morning, dear.
Grandma greeted me with a smile as I sat down at the kitchen table.
How'd you sleep? Fine.
I lied, taking a sip of the hot coffee she set in front of me. She smiled, but there was nothing guarded in her eyes, like she knew more than she was letting on. I spent most of the day outside helping Grandpa with small chores. He didn't say much as usual, but his silence was oddly comforting. The open space of the farm provided a welcome escape from the unnerving atmosphere inside the house. As evening approached, the familiar tension began to settle over me once again. The house seemed to change with the setting sun, becoming heavier, more oppressive. Dinner that night was quiet, too quiet. I noticed that an extra plate at the table had been set. An empty chair, a plate, and silverware, perfectly arranged.
Mom,
I said slowly.
why did you set an extra plate on the table?
She looked up at me, her expression perfectly calm, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes.
It's just an old habit.
She said lightly, as though it was nothing.
Even when no one's here?
I pressed, my voice wavering slightly. She smiled again, that same tight smile that never quite reached her eyes.
Don't worry about it. Didn't know what else to say. I glanced at Grandpa, but he didn't look up from his plate. The silence in the room was suffocating, like a thick blanket draped over everything. After dinner, I found myself drawn back to the guest room. I was tired, but more than that, I was unsettled. The weight of the house, the eerie stillness, the way my grandparents seemed to dodge every question, it was all becoming too much. As I lay in bed that night, my thoughts drifted back to the portrait in the living room. I didn't dare look at it again. After noticing the figure had moved, but the memory of those dark, piercing eyes followed me into the room, watching me even here, in the supposed safety of the guest room. I just felt something drifted off. I heard the footsteps again, pacing slowly back and forth outside my bedroom door. Just as they had the night before, my heart skipped a beat, and I felt my body tense indistinctly. I lay still listening, back and forth, pacing, stopping, just outside my door, as it waited for something. As if it waited for something.
They continued, growing more insistent. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to will them away, but the sound persisted, and I felt the creeping sensation of someone standing just outside the door. With trembling hands, I threw back the blanket and stood up, my legs shaking as I approached the door. My heart raced and my fingers hovered over the doorknob. I hesitated, the memory of the shadow from the night before flashing in my mind. I turned the knob and yanked the door open. Nothing. As I turned, something caught my eye. The door to the closet in my room was slightly ajar. Not hallucinating. This is real.
Oh no. Not the closet.
Not the closet.
Not the closet.
Nothing good ever happens in a closet. So
Okay.
check that out.
Okay. I got some PTSD from closets, I see. I swallowed hard, my heart skipping a beat as I slowly backed into the room. I hadn't opened the closet. I knew for certain it had been closed when I went to bed. Then I started hearing whispers, faint, almost inaudible, coming from the closet, a soft, unintelligible murmur. I stared at the closet door, my hand shaking. The whispers grew louder, but I still couldn't make out the words. They were too muffled, too distant, like they were beckoning me closer. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare approach the door. The whispers seemed to press in from all sides, filling the room with this eerie, disembodied voices. Then the whispers stopped. The house fell silent once again, leaving me standing in the dark, trembling, staring at the half-open closet door.
I eventually mustered the courage to approach the closet and close the door. The next morning, I confronted my grandparents.
Did either of you hear anything last night?
I asked cautiously as we sat around the breakfast table.
Footsteps or voices?
Grandma and Grandpa exchanged a quick glance, their expressions carefully neutral.
Old houses make noises, dear.
Grandma said, her tone light.
Probably just not used to the quiet. No.
I insisted, my voice tightening.
I know what I heard. Someone was pacing outside my door and the closet. It's nothing to worry about.
Grandpa cut in, his voice firm and unyielding. He glanced at me from across the table, his expression unreadable.
Just keep your door closed at night.
The tension in the room was thick, and I knew I wasn't going to get any more answers from them. Whatever was happening in the house, they weren't going to talk about it.
Oh, man!
It's like, when she said old houses make noises, it's like, it's just the house settling. Isn't like that a thing?
Yeah, like, it's just the demons in the house settling. Don't worry about them. Keep your door closed.
Right. Grandma and Grandpa are sus.
They are sus. But I feel like they're also trying to protect him and being like, just fucking listen to us and don't do anything crazy.
Are they trying to protect him, or are they trying to protect themselves from ever being...
Both?
Whatever.
Both?
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe both?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Did I read the tension in the room? But I wasn't imagining things. I knew that one. Something was happening, and it wasn't just in my head. The rest of the day passed in a blur of mundane tasks. I went through the motions, helping Grandpa with jobs around the property, listening to Grandma talk about the weather, the garden, anything except the house and what was happening inside. But when I was outside, the air didn't feel fresh. It felt stifling, as though the weight of the house clung to me, pulling me back, refusing to let me escape its gaze. By the time evening came around, I was exhausted physically and mentally. Dinner that night was quiet as ever. The clinking of silverware was the only sound we ate in near silence. I noticed it again, the extra place setting. The chair had been pulled out slightly, more than it had been the previous night. The plate was aligned perfectly with the empty seat, the silverware positioned neatly beside it. My heart raced as I stared at the empty chair, the faintest hint of movement catching my eye. Okay. It was almost imperceptible, but the chair had shifted just slightly, as though someone was sitting down. No.
I feel like, absolutely not.
I was like, wait, was it like the actual chair? And yes, it was. I blinked, trying to convince myself that I hadn't seen it, but then the chair moved again. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't slide across the floor or jerk violently, but it shifted slowly, as though an invisible presence was adjusting itself, making itself comfortable at the table. My throat tightened, and I glanced at Grandma and Grandpa, expecting them to notice, but they didn't react. They kept eating, completely oblivious to the chair's subtle movement.
Grandma?
I said, my voice barely above a whisper.
That chair. It moved.
She looked up at me, her expression calm and serene.
Oh dear, it's just an old chair. Gaslighting 101.
Yeah, okay, like an old chair just moves on its own. Okay.
Grandma's
Grandma.
a master gaslighter for sure. She's like, you're crazy.
Yeah, okay, Grandma. But her words didn't reassure me. There was something about the way she said it, the casual dismissal, the way her eyes didn't quite meet mine, that sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to say more, but they pretended nothing was wrong, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I nodded weakly and focused on my plate, pretending that everything was fine. But my eyes kept drifting back to the chair, watching for any further movement. The
rest of the dinner dragged on. It was agonizingly silent. I barely touched my food, my appetite completely gone. After dinner, I couldn't stay in the dining room any longer. I excused myself and retreated to the guest room, my mind racing. I paced the room, glancing nervously at the closet door that had been slightly ajar the night before. It was closed now, but the unease lingered. I sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing my temples, trying to make sense of it all. The painting and the strange noises, the chair moving on its own. It was like the house itself was alive. Just as I started to calm down, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. You're onto something. You're onto something with your first theory with the house being alive.
Yeah. I waited for the footsteps to stop outside my door, just as they had the previous nights, but this time they didn't. The footsteps kept moving, passing by my door, fading as they traveled down the hall. I stood there frozen, listening intently. Then after a long moment of silence, I heard it. The creak of a chair. The sound was faint but unmistakable. With trembling hands, I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. It was dark, the faint moonlight casting long shadows on the floor. My feet were silent against the wooden boards as I made my way towards the dining room. As I approached, the air grew colder. The faint sound of silverware scraping against the plate reached my ears. I stopped at the entrance to the dining room, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was waiting for me at the table. But I forced myself to step into the room. The chair was pulled out completely, but no one was there. Slowly, cautiously, I approached the table. The closer I got, the colder the air became.
My hand shook as it reached out to touch the chair. And the moment my fingers brushed the wood, I felt it. A breath. Soft and cold, whispering against the back of my neck. I recoiled, stumbling back from the table, my pulse racing. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the room was empty, except for the faint sound of a low, breathy sigh, too close, too real. I backed out of the room, my heart hammering in my chest. I hurried back down the hallway to the guest room. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. Grandpa said, don't open the goddamn door.
Yeah. He should have listened. I was losing it. That's what I told myself. I was tired, stressed, and my mind was playing tricks on me. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I confronted my grandparents at breakfast.
Why do you set that extra place every night?
I asked, my voice tight with frustration.
Why do you pretend like nothing's wrong?
They exchanged a glance, their faces carefully neutral, but the tension in the room was palpable.
It's just the way things are, dear,
Grandma said quietly.
We've always done it. Don't worry about it. But I am worried. The chair, it's moving. I heard footsteps last night. There's something here, something you're not telling me.
Grandpa finally looked up from his plate, his eyes dark and unreadable.
Well, some things are left best alone,
he said in a low, gravelly voice.
You don't need to understand anything.
I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died in my throat. The look in his eyes was enough to silence me. There was a warning there, a quiet thread that told me I was getting too close to something I wasn't meant to know. I pushed my plate away and stood up from the table. I couldn't sit there any longer, pretending that everything was normal. The house was wrong, the painting was wrong, and my grandparents were hiding something that was growing more dangerous with each passing night. The unease that had been simmering beneath the surface all week was now a full-blown, suffocating dread. After breakfast, I couldn't stand being inside the house any longer. I needed to clear my head, to escape the oppressive feeling that something unseen was lurking in every corner, watching my every move. The unease had been simmering beneath the surface all week was now full-blown, suffocating dread. After breakfast, I couldn't stand being inside the house any longer. I needed to clear my head, to escape the oppressive feeling that something unseen was lurking in every corner, watching my every move. I spent most of the day outside, wandering the property, but no matter how far I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was pulling me back. Like an invisible thread was tugging at my chest, reminding me that I couldn't escape for long. Eventually, I returned to the farmhouse.
I hesitated at the entrance to the living room. My eyes drawn to the family portrait above the fireplace, my heart sank as I stepped closer. The man in the portrait This time, he was no longer standing in the background, partially obscured by the shadows of the other people. Now he was at the very front, his face clear and sharp, his eyes fixed directly on me. His expression had changed to... There was something cruel in the way his lips curled, something dark and malicious in the way he seemed to be staring straight into my soul. The other people in the painting, my grandparents, still long dead relatives, had faded even further into the background, their faces barely visible now. It was as though the man had claimed the entire portrait for himself. I backed away from the painting, my thoughts racing. It wasn't possible, but I couldn't deny what I was seeing. The man in the portrait was watching me, and he was getting closer. I turned to leave the room, my hands shaking as I gripped the edge of the door frame. But before I could step out, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A reflection.
In the large mirror on the opposite wall, I saw him, the man from the portrait, standing in the doorway watching me. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest, but the doorway was empty. Nothing, no one. I stumbled back, nearly tipping over the edge of the carpet, my legs shaking as I bolted out of the room. Mine was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. It was impossible, it couldn't be real. I found myself back in the hallway, my back pressed against the wall as I struggled to catch my breath. My eyes darted around, half expecting to see the man appear again, but the hallway was empty. But something else was wrong. The shadows in the hallway, they didn't look right. I glanced down at the floor, my stomach twisting with dread. The shadows cast by the dim light were distorted, stretching out in unnatural ways. The shadow closest to me, the one near the guest room, was too long, too large. And then I realized it wasn't my shadow. Terrifying! The shadow stayed where it was, unmoving, as though the figure casting it was standing just behind me, out of sight. Slowly I turned, no one. But the shadow was still there, lingering on the floor.
No, thank you.
Nope.
I'm surprised he stayed at the house for this long, by the way. Like, just leave. Just fucking leave.
Yeah. Like,
nice
it's your
visiting you guys.
grandparents.
See you later.
Yeah.
See you in never, ever again.
See you at Christmas at somebody else's house.
Yeah, for sure. 100%. I backed into the guest room, slamming the door behind me, my heart racing. My mind was spinning. I couldn't make sense of it. I didn't understand what was happening or why. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside sent a fresh wave of panic through me. The whispers had returned, soft and distant, coming from the closest closet again. They were louder now, more insistent, beckoning me closer. I lay there staring at the closet door, too afraid to move. The whispers were muffled, garbled, like someone was speaking through layers of fabric. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the sound to go away, but it didn't. It grew louder, more urgent. Finally, I got out of bed and walked toward the closet. My hands trembled as I reached for the door. And then, slowly, I pulled the door open. The closet was empty. At least, it looked empty. But the air inside was cold, much colder than the rest of the room. I could feel it, like a faint breath against my skin. I reached inside, my fingers brushing against the old clothes hanging neatly in a row, but something wasn't right. The clothes.
They were old-fashioned, worn but somehow still new. I pulled one of the shirts off the hanger, my pulse quickening as I inspected it. It was a man's shirt, plain but neatly pressed, the fabric stiff as though it had never been worn. And then it hit me. The clothes looked exactly like the ones worn by the man in the portrait. I dropped the shirt, stumbling back in horror. My hand shook as I slammed the closet door shut. I sat at the edge of the bed, but the room felt smaller, the walls closing in around me. The whispers were gone now, and I forced myself to calm down. The next morning, I confronted my grandparents again.
Who is he?
I demanded, my voice shaking.
The man in the portrait. I've seen him. He's here.
They exchanged another glance, their faces unreadable, but this time there was something darker in their expressions, something they had been hiding. Grandma sighed softly, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her.
He's family,
she said quietly.
He's always been here. What do you mean?
I asked, my heart pounding in my chest.
Who is he? He's one of us,
Grandpa said, his voice low and gravelly.
But He never really left.
Okay.
Excuse me?
Right? I stared at them, trying to make sense of their words. Their words echoed in my mind long after breakfast was over.
He never really left.
What did that mean? The idea that the man from the portrait was part of the family, always present in some way, sent a cold chill down my spine. I didn't know what was worse, the idea that my grandparents believed it, or the fact that after everything I'd seen, I couldn't bring myself to dismiss the nonsense. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, packing my bags, preparing to leave the next morning. I took most of the stuff to my car that evening.
As the evening sun began to set, casting long shadows across the fields, the oppressive weight of the house became almost unbearable. Every part of me wanted to leave, to get out of that place that night and never return. But something held me there, an invisible pull that I couldn't shake. The house, the painting, and my grandparents, they all seemed to be tied together by something darker, something I hadn't yet fully understood. Dinner was quiet, suffocatingly so. My grandparents didn't say much, and I barely touched the food in front of me. I couldn't stop thinking about the portrait, about the man who had moved so close to the front, his eyes locking with mine every time I passed by. I needed to look at it again, to see if something had changed. It was like compulsion pulling me back into that living room. As soon as dinner was over, I slipped away from the table, my feet carrying me almost of their own accord toward the living room. The moment I stepped inside, a cold chill swept over me, freezing me in place for a second. The air in the room felt wrong. It was heavier, more stifling than it should be. I approached the portrait slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The familiar people were all there, my grandparents, their long-deceased relatives, their solemn faces staring out from the past. But as my eyes moved across the canvas, my stomach dropped. The man, he was gone.
My breath hitched and I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I scanned the portrait again, my eyes reaching every corner, every inch of the canvas, but he wasn't there. And the other people had faded even further into the background, their faces barely discernible. I stood frozen, my skin crawling with the cold realization that the man had left the painting. The silence of the room pressured in around me, thick and oppressive. Suddenly, I had the overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone in the room anymore. I turned quickly, my eyes darting to the doorway, but it was empty. My pulse raced as I took a shaky step back from the portrait, the cold dead settling deep in my bones. Then I saw something, a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. At the far end of the hallway, just beyond the faint glow of the light, was a person. He stood still, barely visible in the dim light. I blinked, my heart pounding in my ears, and he was gone.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
This story is crazy. I haven't been talking much because, it's so good. This story's wild.
Make it into, a little, horror film.
Oh, for sure.
This time he was closer, standing just a few feet away, his dark eyes fixed on me.
My body locked in terror. I stole him back, unable to tear my eyes away from him. He was tall, much taller than I had imagined, and his features were sharper, more defined, more sinister than they had been in the painting. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, they were black, bottomless, like they were drawing me in, pulling me toward him. He took a step closer. My legs finally responded, and I bolted. I ran out of the living room, down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the suffocating silence of the house. My mind was a blur of panic, my heart racing as I turned corner after corner. I reached the guest room and slammed the door shut behind me. The room was dark, the only light coming from the silver of moonlight sipping through the curtains. The air felt colder, here, thicker. A cold draft brushed the back of my neck, and I froze. Slowly I turned my head toward the corner of the room, dread curling tight in my chest. There he was.
Standing in the corner of the room just a few feet away, his form was darker now, almost blending into the shadows, but I could see him, looming over me like a predator. The room seemed to warp around him, the walls shifting and blending as if they were being pulled toward him. He didn't speak, but I could feel his presence in every inch of the room, pressing down on me, suffocating me with his gaze. I had to leave, now. I drew the door open and ran out the door towards the stairs, my footsteps loud and frantic in the otherwise silent house. I didn't stop until I reached the front door, grabbing my car keys and stumbling out onto the porch. The cold night of the air hit me like a slap, but it wasn't enough to chase away the terror crawling at my insides. I stepped out into the yard, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Of what had just happened. I'm going to read that over again. I stepped out into the yard, grasping for air, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I hopped into my car, and as I was about to drive off, I glanced back at the house one more time and I saw them. My grandparents. They were standing on the porch, watching me with unreadable expressions. Their faces were calm, almost serene, but there was something unnerving in the way they looked at me, like they were expecting this, like they were waiting for it.
What the fuck?
And then, behind them, the man from the portrait.
Oh. He stood tall, his dark eyes gleaming in the moonlight. His hand rested on my grandfather's shoulder, his long, pale fingers curling around him like claws. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just watched. As they drove away from the farmhouse, my hand shaking on the steering wheel, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The house grew smaller in the distance, disappearing into the darkness of the night. Had it been a week since I left the farmhouse, I hadn't told anyone what happened. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know if I even believed it myself. Memories felt hazy now, like fragments of a nightmare that refused to leave me. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, the man from the portrait, standing there watching.
I tried to settle back into my life in the city, but nothing felt normal anymore. The sounds of traffic, the crowded streets, they didn't comfort me like they used to. I felt restless and anxious. Late one night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. It rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something about it tugged at my gut, filling me with an inexplicable sense of dread. I answered it.
Hello?
My voice cracked, my hand trembling slightly as I held the phone to my ear. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a long stretch of silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I waited, my breath catching in my throat. Finally, a voice, soft and familiar.
Dear?
It was my grandmother. My stomach dropped. I hadn't spoken to her since the night I left, and hearing her voice now crackling through the phone sent a cold shiver down my spine.
Grandma? Yes, dear?
Her tone was calm, almost too calm.
It's been a while. We were just wondering when you might come back.
I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry.
I'm not sure. I don't think... Your room is still ready for you.
She interrupted, her voice soft but insistent.
And the portrait? Well, it's still hanging there, waiting for you.
My heart pounded in my chest. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Then, in the background, I heard it. A faint rustling like someone moving around, adjusting something. And then a voice, low, deep, and unmistakable.
I'm waiting.
It wasn't Grandpa. It was him. The light went dead. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking as cold sweat broke out across my skin. He was still there, and somehow he reached out to me. The man in the portrait wasn't a distant relative. He was something else, something tied to the house, to the family. And now he was trying to claim me. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't know if I ever would again.
Damn, Ma! That's crazy!
That was such a good story.
That's really good. Holy shit!
My God. The man in the portrait was able to call and mimic his grandmother so he could answer?
Seemed like it, right? You think the grandparents are dead?
I don't know.
That's one that reread that last part. Chills. Chills all over. That's phenomenal story. We just keep getting lucky. These stories have been so good lately.
Yeah.
Dang, that was really good. Really
was
well
so
written
good.
too. Really well written. I don't think I have any complaints really. It was good.
Yeah.
The only critique I have is not for the author, but for the fucking protagonist. I would have left so much sooner. So much sooner. As soon as the first portrait thing changed, I'm like, I actually need to get back to the city. I got some work to do. I would have made every excuse under the sun. I would have been gone.
Agreed. That
Also,
was...
being out in the country and being isolated like that was one of those things. No thanks.
You see what I mean? Terrifying, scary, creepy, all the words.
He should have claimed you when he/it had a chance. There's no way you're turning back to that house, right? Right? That's from the comments. Did that person replace your grandfather?
Right?
Someone said, he's always been there. It's the perfect unprompted sentence to convince me that he was not, in fact, always there.
Truly.
And
then
good,
the last...
man. That was a good story.
The last comment, basically what you said, you should have left as soon as you felt uncomfortable. You took too long to leave, and he knows it.
Yeah, and he wants you back now.
Yeah.
Grandfather said, don't open up the doors. Don't open up nothing. Just go to sleep. He had to fucking provoke this demon spirit entity thing. Had to poke the bear, as some might say. God. When he opened the closet, I was like, you fucking idiot. Also, how big is this fucking house? He said he was running around corners. Like,
I don't know. He said
he's like turning corner after corner. I'm like, dang, how big is this house? So a fucking plantation house? What the fuck?
That's what I thought at first when he was like a kid, but then when he went back as an adult, he said it was smaller than he remembers. So I don't know.
I don't know. He seemed like he was struggling to get around. Really good. Really good story. I'm really glad that the author let us rate this.
Yeah.
CreepyStoriesJR. If anyone needs a reminder, that is the author. Phenomenal. Very good story. Very much enjoyed. I like the slow build up too, and I really like how they didn't. How do you say? Like the presence, the entity was apparent, but it wasn't too in your face, right?
Yeah.
They made it so that it was there, and then the last time you saw it was on the porch, and you're like, oh shit. But
it was really
it wasn't
there.
like in your face, like, you know, it was more like psychologically, like, something's not right. Where some stories are like, here's the monster, and it's just there. Okay, well. But this one was good. I liked it.
That was so good. This
Very
is probably
good.
one of my favorite ones.
Yeah, you keep saying that about every single one. We
I
gotta pick one.
know.
We're gonna have to do like a ranking one day, and then we'll have to rate all of our like a tier rating. You know how some people do on like what's best and what we thought was really good and what was not. But so far, all of our stories have been so good. It's really gonna be so hard to choose. Other than that, I really got nothing else to say except that was super good. I liked it.
Wait, what would you rate it on the 1 to 10 scale?
Like an 8 for sure. Just because it's the way they described it, it was so good because people see shadows in their bedrooms all the time when they're sleeping, like when they're just around their house and it's dark or just anywhere, right? And you just think that someone's there, but it's not. That's pretty scary. That's real. That's very real world, like fear.
Yeah.
So I liked it. This author did a really good job. Really good job. I'm surprised. Oh, they posted this 1 day ago. I didn't realize.
Oh, damn.
I wonder if it's been posted on other things before this though. No, yeah, this story is brand new.
That was so good.
Very good. I gotta like, I really liked it. And I say that about like almost all the stories that we read, but we haven't really read any bad ones. Like the first ever story we read that we never posted was not great. But everything after that has been pretty good. I would say the only story that maybe is not like up to speed, like up to like these stories, is the one with the guy following them home. You know what I'm talking about? What was it?
Oh yeah,
The
cat that wasn't.
Yeah.
Yeah,
What's up, man?
yeah.
Weird story.
I would
It was
agree.
good, but like that one would probably be at the bottom. But these other stories are good. This story was phenomenal. That's, I mean, I don't know what else to say, really. It was scary. It gave me chills. Like, I was invested. Usually, commenting throughout the story, I couldn't even comment because I was like, what's happening next?
Like, what do you
What's
say
happening
other than that's creepy?
Right.
Fuck,
Also,
I want to know what else is next.
the format that they did for the way that they closed out, like, sections, I really liked. And I think you caught on eventually in how we were switching off. But when it would be like like a phrase, like, here we go. When I would read, the footsteps stopped. It was just that one sentence in that one paragraph. I don't know why, but that was super powerful. Like, every time, like, you would read a section and then it would stop with like, I turned into the knob and yanked the doorknob. Nothing. Or, let's see what else. There's a few other ones that I was like, oh yeah. Like my heart sank as I stepped closer. And that was like a whole sentence, right? And then the man in the portrait, right? Or that was not even as strong as like some other ones. It was like, just great. Oh, here we go. I approached the portrait slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Familiar people were all there, grandparents, close deceased relatives, their solemn faces. But my eyes moved closer to the canvas. My stomach dropped. The man, he was gone. Like, the way he closed out like sections and like parts of the story with like just like a phrase,
Yeah.
I really liked that. Liked how he did that.
It made it easy to follow the story, and then also it made it really easy it was just an easy read.
Yeah. No, the format
In a good way.
was very good. Like, the dialogue was perfect. It wasn't like embedded in paragraphs. It was its own line. And the story was its own line. So that was easy for me, for sure. And it just ran smooth. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, we've read stories where like they're really good, but the way that they formatted it was like almost confusing.
Yeah.
This was really good. Very well formatted. Read very easily. And it's almost like, and then I might be giving a lot of credit, but it's almost like they read it out loud first and then they typed it in. Because we've run into that problem before where it's like, and I say like so much, but they type it out and they try to get a little fancy with it. And I get it, be a little fancy.
Right.
But they don't read it out loud. And then it doesn't work when you're reading it out loud. Right? It might work when you're reading it on the paper, because your mind tends to fix things when you're reading it to yourself. But reading it out loud was sometimes clunky. I don't really think this was clunky at all. I think this was like very good. Very well written story. Not just creepy, but well written. All good
but
things.
Also creepy.
Very creepy.
Yeah.
Great story. Thank you again for letting us read it. We had a great time. And that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed the story. It was a nice long one for you. I think it was about an hour or so. So, hope you guys enjoyed. Don't forget to drop that comment. I'm looking at you. Anyway, thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, comment, follow the Discord, follow the Reddit. We're on Instagram, TikTok, all that stuff. So, go check that out. Look at our shorts that we do for little clips. Other than that, this is one of those endings and one of those stories where it's like, I'll help you sleep well tonight, because this was about sleeping. And if you're getting stuff like this, good luck. We'll see you next time, and thanks for watching.